International at the University of Edinburgh. I'm very happy to be able to welcome the audience and also the panellists here today for an event entitled Global Heritage, Global Ambitions, Scotland's International Relations. I think it would have been slightly more fortuitous if this event had taken place yesterday on Burns Night, given the global resonance of our national poet, but the morning after is perhaps the next best thing, or perhaps not, depending on how you celebrate Burns Night. It's fitting, I think, that we're holding this event in our newly refurbished McEwan Hall, where our graduations takes place every year. Every year, students from more than 160 countries graduate from here, some in person, some virtually, and our students go off into the world. They bring diversity to our city, into our campuses, and they bring opinion, experience and perspective to teaching, learning and especially debate, and I'm hoping that will happen here today. I know that a very good number of students here in the audience today, which is especially good for a Friday afternoon. Foreign policy, of course, affects all of us. Perhaps above all, it affects those of us for whom life is international, like the 43%, 16,000 of our students from around the world, and also those whose future ambitions are global, for people who see the world in perhaps a slightly different way. I'd like to thank the British Foreign Policy Group for organising today's event. This is the first time we've worked together to organise something like this, and we've had a very good turnout. We're very pleased for that. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Asia Scotland Institute and the University Centre for Security Research. We have two very exciting and diverse panel sessions this afternoon. We are lucky to host and be able to hear from leading figures from international politics, government, business and the arts. I'm delighted also to see academic colleagues from the University of Edinburgh, but from other universities around Scotland taking part here today. I'm also delighted to see student involvement, especially in the form of Sofia Cogliano, who is a British Foreign Policy Group Student Ambassador here at Edinburgh. Sofia is one of 5 student ambassadors at the university, who, as well as supporting events such as this, works very hard to build connections and keep conversations going around foreign policy across the university and in the broader community. And I guess that means that thinking about foreign policy and debating the future of the world is really about a conversation and a journey rather than a destination and a presentation. Mentioning destinations and presentations reminds me to thank my colleagues at Edinburgh Global, who, led by Julia Hermiston, who've organised this event, which will take place seamlessly and professionally, especially upon my imminent departure. I'd like to thank them very much for all the hard work they put into place. I'd like to take one final opportunity to welcome our panellists and thank them for participating today. Thank you very much for coming on this kind of grim January afternoon. And I'd like to hand over to Tom Cargill, Executive Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Thank you very much, and I hope today's event goes really well.
Did you do the fire?
I didn't. I just remembered that. So the fire. If there's a fire alarm, it is not a drill. It is actually a fire, and you should make your way through the fire exits, which I believe are very conveniently placed right there and there. So that's my housekeeping. That's it. I should now pass over to the substantive bit of the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you to Edinburgh University for hosting us. And thank you very much to our sponsors of the British Foreign Policy Group, which is Strategy International, Universities UK, the FCO now as well. And I'd particularly like to thank our speakers, and I'll introduce them in a minute, and particularly you, the audience. And I should thank especially our brilliant student ambassadors who've helped prepare the event today, and my colleagues Edward and Alice, who have done all the work. So this meeting will be on the record, but please can you all turn your phones to silent, but please do keep your phones on, because we want to encourage people to tweet and do the whole social media thing, and the Twitter hashtag we're using is #GlobalEdinburgh, so feel free, all on the record. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but a little bit about the British Foreign Policy Group, why we were established and what we're trying to do. So our purpose as a non-partisan, independent organisation is to try and improve the quality of discussion about the UK's place in the world and our foreign policy. And by foreign policy, we mean everything to do with our international engagements, whether that's trade, security, diplomacy, or development. we were really established in the wake of the referendum on the EU to try and break down what appears to many people an increasingly narrow and top-down discussion of the UK's foreign policy, and to try and move away from and refresh some of the increasingly tired rhetoric that is used, especially in public discussion about our international position and choices. We want to stimulate and support the emergence of new ideas and new voices, and bring more of the UK into a discussion about what we all want and need as a country from our international engagements. And we particularly feel that the UK is not using a fraction of the skills and expertise on many international issues that we have as a country, and that particularly applies to Scotland as well, I think. We want this discussion to be more honest and more grounded. We want to promote more of a discussion about what we in this country need from our international relations to maintain our lifestyles. Overseas trade in particular is essential to pay for our schools, healthcare and jobs, but also about how we protect and promote internationally the values which underpin our ability to trade. A sense of fairness, rule of law, a sense of common humanity, care for our planet, all the things which are now under renewed assault around the world. We want to talk about the tensions that sometimes arise amidst all of this. And most of all, we want to hear from you. We want to hear from people around the UK and develop a stronger, more effective exchange of views between policymakers and the UK public, so we can ensure our national foreign policy is and is seen to be more rooted and in an honest and informed national discussion. And that's not to say that we're always going to agree with everything our government does in our name, but it should at least allow our leaders to lead with a greater awareness of what people across the UK think, not just those closest to hand. And my own hope is that at our best, when a large number of us can get behind a course of action, as we've seen historically around such movements as the abolition of slavery or the creation of the United Nations and a rules-based international system, such an alignment can make our government and our country a genuinely powerful force in world affairs for our own benefit and the benefit of others. But it all starts with a conversation. That's why I'm so pleased that you're all here today. What I'll do is ask our speakers starting with Emily, and then Alasdair, and then Tim, and then Caroline and Sofia, to make some remarks for 5 minutes at the beginning. And then we will open it up. I'm interested in your views and your perspectives. Often it's routine to say in these meetings, please keep your points to questions and keep them short. I do want to encourage you to keep it short, and I will be quite strict on enforcing that. But I'm not just interested in questions, I'm also interested in your perspectives. And I'm hoping it's going to be a busy panel, but I'm hoping that we can set up a genuine kind of exchange of views. I think let's go straight in. Emily, if you want to kick off for 5 minutes on. So we distributed some of the questions that we're particularly interested in ahead of this event around what are the particular concerns of people here and more broadly in Scotland that you feel aren't being addressed adequately in UK foreign policy. How do we build more of an honest exchange of views between the public and policymakers on our place in the world? And what are the changes that are taking place around the world that's really going to impact us over coming years? So perhaps, Emily, if you want to reflect on those for 5 minutes, and then we'll go along the panel and take it from there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. It's so nice to be here, and so interesting to hear the approach that you're going to be taking. It's great to be here in global Edinburgh after a somewhat hard and arduous week. Down in Westminster, I can tell you that shadowing Boris Johnson can be a pretty tough job at the best of times, even when he's just playing at being Foreign Secretary. But when he's also doubling up as Chancellor and Health Secretary and Deep Sea Bridge Architect, all in the same week, it can be pretty tiring. And I'm very pleased to be here as part of this distinguished panel, and a panel that includes Caroline from the Foreign Office, who I'm sure knows a thing or two about demanding weeks and Boris Johnson. I'm looking forward very much to our discussion today, because I do find it fascinating and important when we talk about the historic contribution that Scotland in particular has made and must make to shaping British foreign policy, because I believe that the contribution is pretty unique. I have to say, I've never attended a debate or a seminar which has been about the contribution or the necessary contribution of the Welsh or people from the East Midlands or from London or the North East, or for that matter Northern Ireland. But to talk about the Scottish contribution, I think is appropriate, and I think that it's essential. And I think that there's two main reasons for that. The first, obviously, is a very prosaic one, which is that it's a devolved issue, and so it's really important that the Scottish government, no matter which party's in power, is properly consulted on matters of foreign policy and properly listened to in Westminster, as are the Scottish people. And the second reason is more abstract, and it's more difficult, I think, to describe, but let me have a go. It's the notion which I think we all share, that there is something distinctive about Scottish thinking and Scottish values that they bring us to foreign policy, that Britain as a whole will benefit from. It's partly about the internationalism of Scotland, which I think is ingrained in the Scottish psyche, and I think that it comes from way back. It comes back from military alliances that were made in the Middle Ages. It comes from the surge in trade in the 18th century. It comes from the Enlightenment. It comes from inward migration and outward migration over the last centuries or so. It's an internationalism which is born of geographical and political and economic necessity, but it's inspired so many of the greatest Scottish minds to develop political ideas and their philosophy which has the rest of the world in mind and not just our own backyard. And I think that is really important. And I think that it's also partly down to kinship. And the people of Scotland have with other nationalities around the world, there are large Scottish communities, as I say, from migration and from immigration, but there are Scots in every English-speaking corner of the world, and there is direct kinship there. But also, Scotland is the home of thriving diasporas from all other countries of the world. Historically from Ireland and from South Asia, but more recently from Poland and Nigeria and elsewhere. But I think that it's more than kinship. I think that it goes further. I think that actually it's about empathy and it's about solidarity, which is a much maligned word. But I think that it says a great deal. I think that it talks to the passion that the people of Scotland bring to supporting the rights of other oppressed minorities, of embattled nations, people facing severe hardship all around the world. And nobody needs an in-depth history lesson to explain why that would have some resonance in Scotland. And so I think that kind of solidarity, that sort of kinship, is ingrained in Scottish psyche. And finally, I think that it's partly due, in fact, to the Scottish Enlightenment, which said, that all political thinking in Scotland had to be imbued with moral and ethical and philosophical dimensions, and about the world that we all aspire to live in. And there's an understanding that should be underpinning all our actions, and it's vital to our understanding of foreign policy development, which I think is too often missing. I think it's too often missing when we deal with the sort of realpolitik approach to foreign policy, which seems to, at the moment at least, just be talking about the bottom line and the principle that whatever America says is right. And so there are three factors: a devoted internationalism, an unshakable belief in global justice, a moral framework for decision making, and they're all, in very broad and brief summary, why I believe that the Scottish contribution to foreign policy remains so influential and so integral. Let me just say one last thing. I don't think it's any coincidence that, in my view, the greatest Foreign Secretary in my lifetime, Robin Cook, and the greatest Chancellor in my lifetime, Gordon Brown, both were proud sons of this university and this nation. And they brought those values to work in the work that they did. Robin, who introduced ethical dimension to foreign policy, and Gordon, who transformed the role of Chancellor, not just so that it wasn't just about managing the economy here at home, but also about saving lives overseas. And although Gordon and Robin didn't always see eye to eye, we all know that, when it came to foreign policy, they did have a shared horror in the aftermath of the Iraq War that enabled them to set aside their historic feud, and they became close friends in the years before Robin's tragic death. So I may not have Scottish blood in my veins, but I believe that those values are in my veins. And I believe that it's time to put Scottish values back at the heart of our foreign policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Alasdair, would you like to follow up?
Well, thank you very much. I think, like Emily, I've come from a burn supper, and I'm probably heading for one later on, probably tonight and certainly tomorrow night as well. So we're coming at a season where we've got the opportunity to reflect, as you've rightly said, on the internationalism of Robert Burns and what that's meant for us. I think one thing I'm choosing to say as a politician at all the burn suppers I go to is to point to one fact that probably a lot of people haven't really thought about when it comes to Robert Burns, which was that he didn't have a vote. And like 95% of people in the country, of course, at that point, not only did he not have a vote, but it was probably verging on criminality for him to actually ask to have a vote. So that kind of puts Burns' radicalism in perspective, and his internationalism and his interest in things like the French Revolution and certainly the American Revolution in context too. Anyway, what I wanted to say was when we look at this debate that we're having, or hopefully it's this discussion that we're having about the need for more capacity for foreign policy discussion and decision in Scotland, I think it's largely about making sure that Scotland's external relationships as a country with the world are to some extent normalised, and certainly to ensure that Scotland remains an attractive place to the rest of the world. I think we have a very attractive brand, but I think there's a lot more that we can do to make of that. And I think that this university is a great example of the attractiveness of Scotland to students from around the world. I think one of the other things I'm proud to say as the Minister for International Development that Scotland has done, I think, to enhance our reputation internationally is the fact that we have an international development policy and an international development budget, despite the fact that these things are ultimately reserved. We have, with agreement with the UK government and with agreement across the parties, we do, I think, do important work in the countries that we work in, not least in Malawi, with which we have a long and enduring relationship. So I think that when we seek to project ourselves as a country in the world, it's important that we can do so not just in terms of our heritage or not just in terms of the way we see ourselves, important as the cultural and historical side of this is, but in terms of what we are actually doing for some of the world's most vulnerable people too. It's also important that we are able, I hesitate to use the word diplomatic, but to have a diplomatic presence in the sense that we have hubs now in a number of countries where we seek to promote the Scottish economy and to build up intergovernmental relations. But perhaps, and you would expect me to turn to this, the most pressing and the most difficult area of foreign policy for Scotland is Europe. 62% of people in this country voted to remain in the European Union, and the task for us now is to see what can be salvaged from the Brexit disaster. And Scotland does have something distinctive to say. Scotland wants to be a bit more than consulted on that. Scotland wants to make sure that we emerge from this situation in the single market and able to ensure that we have a demographic situation considered. Scotland's demographic situation is that we rely 100% on people from other European countries or other countries in the world coming to live here to ensure that our working age population grows in the future. And if I want to end on one pressing issue, it is that pressing issue. We have to remain in the single market and we have to maintain the freedom of movement of people.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so we'll turn now to Tim and I didn't really do an introduction for either of you, Emily or Alasdair, partly because I felt that no introduction was required. Tim, I don't think much introduction is required, but we should perhaps just explain that you're president of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce from a business background, or former army as well, is that right? Property, private equity background.
And a banker.
And in particular engagement with youth as well, right?
Yeah.
Children's Youth Foundation.
Yeah.
let's...
Okay, right, great. Can I stand up? Because I've got a script here which my policy wonk at Scottish Chambers of Commerce wrote for me, and really it is terribly inappropriate for this environment.
Read it.
Yeah, it's so boring. And on a Friday afternoon, with so many young faces here who are thinking of, I wonder when we'll be allowed to leave this, I don't think I'll deliver what I've been given. So let me just reflect, if I may, as fast as I can, on what matters to me in the international context, because we're surrounded by experts, policy experts, genuine experts from the Foreign Commonwealth Office, the Director for Europe. That's a great job, isn't it? I would definitely want that. And keep me right. When 5 minutes are up, cut my throat. Right, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am, for one of my many sins, the President of Scottish Chambers of Commerce. What is that? That is 12,000 businesses, SMEs, as we call them, the small, medium-sized enterprises, which are the backbone of any economy of any country. The SMEs who form a vast majority of the people working in the private sector in this nation. And we are connected in an international network of chambers of commerce to 100,000 other chambers of commerce around the world, from Kazakhstan to Manhattan and all the rest of it. So it's a global network. And like many people in business, we try to think globally. Except in Scotland, we singularly are failing on that point. I'm talking about trade and exporting. If I can move away from perhaps statementing about the wider intent of the Scottish people of being integrated members of the world community, and talk to you about actually the real shortcomings and challenges we face at the moment, and the assets we have to reverse that situation. Because what we're all about here, what our colleagues here from politics are all about, is managing our nation fairly and to create wealth for the people, the wealth of nations, as Adam Smith put it, to be shared equally and fairly as far as possible amongst the people who work here. And to those who work very hard and are very successful, of course, the benefits lie to you. But also to leave no person behind and to enrich the wider community. And great institutions like Edinburgh University or my own St Andrews University benefit from that wealth creation which goes on in the private sector and is shared out more broadly amongst the people who need it most in the country. So that premise is about wealth creation. What all business is about is creating wealth for the business owners, because that's what motivates people. At the same time, ensuring people are treated fairly who work for those companies. And that is one of the aspects about internationalism, internationalization, which we're seeing now, is we also have to be able to give a lead as a country, as a developed Western liberal democracy, on the more responsible ways of business practices, which have been neglected for far too long. Any of you who had the pleasure and the privilege of watching Blue Planet know the revolution that's taken place on plastic bags since that wonderful programme. And all my members would endorse, we must try and do business better. But what we are not doing in Scotland at the moment, and this is not the blame of any government, not a legacy blame, this is an interesting problem that Scotland faces, is our exports are in decline. If I may throw some facts and figures at you, 2016, the latest figures we had came out this week. There's 76 billion of exports in Scotland, okay, to the outside world, of which 61% goes to the rest of the UK. 21% goes out to the rest of the world. That includes India, China, and America, and Australasia, and South America, and all that stuff. And then 17% goes to Europe. Now, what does that tell me? It tells me that there's an enormous opportunity because we're not fulfilling our ability to trade as we used to have with the rest of the world. The Scots seem to have lost that knack. Now, that's not a government failure, that's not a failure of policy, that's something that's in us that we're not doing. We seem to be afraid of going out and trading. If I could recommend to students in this room any one thing to take away from what I'm saying to you today, is read the book, The Scottish Enlightenment, How the Scots Invented the Modern World by Arthur Herman, the wonderful American academic. It is a polemic book, of course, and it supposes that Scotland invented the world. Well, it shows me that we went through generations of enlightened people, educated people from this country, who went abroad and created enormous wealth. Now, we might have some concerns about how that wealth was used or how it was extracted in those days, and of course time has moved on. There's no reason why, as a strong, liberal democratic country with incredibly high quality education, that we can't adopt the modern world that we're facing and go out and export effectively. But that just doesn't mean making more widgets. It's not more factories in the Central Belt. It's about thinking what exporting actually is. And that's one of my privileges in life is I'm on the court at St Andrews University. I see education as one of our greatest national products for exporting. Bringing young people from all over the world into our institutions and for them to benefit from our hundreds of years of educational experience and sending it back out into the world as advocates for what Britain has to offer is one of our most compelling arguments we can make in this country. And I think that the continued pressure from the Scottish Government, and indeed from the Labour Party, on the current UK Westminster Government about the after-study visas is vitally important. We need more students in this country, and they need to be welcome to stay, because our demography in this country doesn't support the current direction we're going in. So, what I'm saying to you is there is a problem with exporting, there's a problem with trade. We need to address it as an attitudinal shift in the country needs to take place. And I think that's why meetings like this, a dialogue like this, is extremely important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So Caroline, turn now to you, and I'll introduce you a little bit. So, as Tim said, Caroline is the Director for Europe at the FCO, and as far as you've served in every major capital, it seems. Well, Beijing, Moscow, Brussels,
all the really
Washington?
No.
Okay,
Hong
but
Kong.
still.
Not
Hong
capital,
Kong,
capital, but important nonetheless.
Highly experienced, Ms. Bottom line, and thank you very much, Caroline, for joining us.
I feel nervous about being described as a genuine expert as opposed to all the other experts out there. I'm also conscious that you don't want tired rhetoric, you've told us. But this is on the record, so I have to be mindful of that as well, so not be too exciting or interesting. Having said that, just picking up on what Emily said, we are actually in the Foreign Office very much about building bridges to the continent, maybe not just the one, but as we leave the European Union, we need to make sure that we do not leave Europe. So that is what we are very busy doing in the Foreign Office and with colleagues across Whitehall. I'm really thrilled to be here today. As others have said, it'd be fantastic if this happens more broadly in other parts of the country. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for you, for this university, for Edinburgh and for Scotland to actually get ahead of the game and actually show the rest of the UK up in this respect, because we ought to be doing more of these type of events on foreign policy, and I hope with the British Foreign Policy Group we will be doing that. Honestly, I think foreign policy is quite London-centric, and foreign policy is hard. It's really hard, so we need all the help that we can get. We need the creative ideas and the influence that you can also bring to bear. So I hope we're going to hear a lot from all of you today. The devolved administrations, and Scotland in particular, you devolved nations have got so much to bring to the party in terms of foreign policy, as globalisation is such a major challenge that we wrestle with, but we've got to be local, we've got to be regional, and as we're seeing, we have to really establish the contacts between peoples and not just between nations. And as others have said, the strength of the Scottish character and of this nation can deliver so much for us overseas, and it's something I've seen myself in China and in Russia and indeed in Europe as well. I've noticed the fantastic, well not just noticed but read the fantastic documents, Scotland's international framework. I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but I think there are some great objectives here in terms of influencing the world around us. I think again, Scotland excels in this. We're just seeing this with Burns at the moment, but increasingly we have to influence with soft power, and that is something which, as I say, Scotland excels in. And the point about creating an environment within Scotland that supports a better understanding of international opportunities and the ability to seize them. As you were saying, trade is something that we generally still in the UK are not strong enough at. And a lot of that is about understanding better the world around us. So I think it's fair to say we are entering a new era as we leave the EU. This is an opportunity, it is an opportunity to think again, to look at how we are acting internationally and to seek to approach the global challenges and opportunities in a new way. As we seek to open new global trading opportunities, I think we're going to have the foreign policy that matches those. It can't just be about trade, it has to be about foreign policy as well. So again, a great opportunity for us. That's all I'll say for the moment, because there are lots of questions to come. But thank you.
Thank you very much. So, brilliant. So, Sophia, do you want to say a few words? And so you're studying. So, Sophia is one of our student. In fact, are you the head student ambassador here? Oh, I know. Sorry, but one of our brilliant student ambassadors. One of the things that the British Foreign Policy Group is trying to do, because a meeting does not make a meaningful engagement. So we're trying to find and understand different ways that we can continue and broaden these conversations to help build them into a more meaningful dialogue. And one of the routes is by the recruitment of a network of student ambassadors, mainly based at universities all around the UK. And Sophia is very kindly one of the student ambassadors up here. You're saying international relations. I should have asked what aspect you're particularly interested in.
Sure. So I'm particularly interested in international economic cooperation and policy, specifically how the media covers these issues and presents them to the public, and where, if and where they fail to do so. So obviously Brexit then occupies a lot of my mind, because that's an issue where economic issues were not so well covered. Studying international relations and law means I'm perhaps particularly interested in all of these issues, but something that I do think is that Brexit has enabled a discussion to cause more widely. Something that I think is that for a specific article of the Lisbon Treaty to be talked about in the mainstream is kind of a victory in itself, I think. But I think that it is helping people to be involved. Quite unsurprisingly, I do think that we need to create a better dialogue within the country. I really do think that is how we'll fix it, if we all talk to each other more about it, and try and increase understanding of these issues. To introduce myself personally, so I'm a British, Swedish, American trinational. I have a child of two foreign parents who came here 25 years ago to stay for a year and never left. But now is a pretty good time to have both a British and a European passport. I think, yeah, and then but I feel very emboldened by what has just been said about the Scottish character, because I do feel Scottish in my outlook and identity, having grown up here and then obviously stayed for university, partially due to free tuition fees, which helps, of course. And yet, so I'm one of 5 student ambassadors at the university, and we're trying to kind of increase engagement with foreign policy issues through events like these, but also just trying to encourage students to talk about it more.
Great, thank you very much, Sophia. Okay, so I'd like to open it up to the audience now. There's a lot of issues covered. One of the issues that I'm really interested in is this tension, this relationship between the really critical things that both Alasdair and Emily were talking about in terms of our values and the values that we are representing and supporting abroad, but also this absolutely central issue of trade, and how do we ensure that we can maintain the trade which supports our lifestyles, our opportunities, and our ability to actually shape the world in support of the values that we support. So I'd be really interested in comments or points about that, or indeed about anything else that the panellists have raised. If you do have a question or a point, if you can maybe just say who you are before you speak. And by all means, make it a point. But as I say, please do keep it short. So who's going to be brave and kick off? This gentleman at the front.
David Stevenson.
In fact, there's mics coming as well. So.
Hi, David Stevenson, semi-retired honorary fellow in population health sciences. A question on Catalonia. I meet Catalans in Edinburgh, in the university and elsewhere, and as far as I can gather, all of them are in favour of Catalan independence. Would the panel welcome the expansion of the international community by the admission of an independent Catalonia?
And I'm not suggesting it doesn't, but could you be explicit about how that is important for the UK and for Scotland?
Well, the Scottish independence movement and the Catalan independence movements have quite close relationships, and the Catalan flags appear at Scottish meetings and Scottish ones appear at Catalan meetings. And I think we would like to know, we're rather upset with the European Union and with the United Kingdom being very dismissive of Catalan ambitions.
Okay.
And we feel that they relate to our ambitions. I'd rather make the case about Catalonia rather than about Scotland, so possibly people could take it a bit more without prejudice.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's have another one. The gentleman, Martin, around.
Sorry, who?
This gentleman.
Hello, Martin Bell, Scotch Whisky Association. Thanks very much for very rich and varied contributions. I was really interested in many things that Caroline said, but one really struck me, and that was we should have more foreign policy in our trade policy. And I think it would be quite nice to have more trade policy in our foreign policy. So I'd be interested to hear views from the panel on what place does trade policy have in our external relations.
Good. Thank you, Martin. And then there was another one. Was there a gentleman? Is that gentleman right? Oh, the gentleman here. Yes, thank you.
David Birrell, Director of the Asia Scotland Institute. There was a meeting here in Edinburgh where 80 leaders, business leaders, influencers got together to discuss what should happen for the city, for the country, for the UK. There was 3 actions came out of the meeting in no particular order. One was access to finance for SMEs. Second was skills development. And the third one was to reach out internationally for trade. The meeting was held on the High Street 232 years ago. We have the minutes in the Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce. And my question is, so no one sits in 232 years again and says these were the 3 things that came up and no actions were carried out. Lots of stuff, lots of ideas, but just given the opportunity to panel members here today, if there was one real thing that you wanted to see happen over the next 12 months, what would it look like?
Oh, good. Thank you. All right, so there's some meaty issues there. I mean, you can comment on all of it, of course, but I'm really, Alasdair and Emily in particular, this, the role of trade as part of our foreign policy. I'd be particularly interested in what your view of, and this kind of thought, how do we crack this kind of ongoing structural balance of payment challenge that we have in this country?
Well, you had a very skillfully crafted question there, because I don't think I anticipated the end of it when you said this was 232 years ago. It's kind of depressing. I suppose that what I would say about the relationship between trade policy and international policy is that, yes, we have to do everything we can to make sure that we think we have trade at the very heart of what we do internationally. But I just wanted to offer one perspective on all this as the Minister for International Development in Scotland, which is that much as we want to ensure, and we certainly do want to ensure, that our relationship with the developing world is not just about aid, it's about trade, I do have a difficulty with some of what the UK government has said about how aid should be in our national interest. So I think there are important areas of separation that have to be maintained in some of that. But if you want me to name one thing that I would like to see happen for the benefit of our international trade and relationship in Scotland, and I'm afraid you can guess what it's going to be in the next 12 months, it would be that the voices within industry in Scotland are listened to, and that some reasonable arrangement is reached whereby we can continue to have tariff-free trade in Europe, and you know what that means. Do you want me to comment on the other 2 questions, or stick to that? I mean, the other ones, obviously you mentioned Catalonia there. I should say David has the distinction of having been at every single meeting I have ever been to in Edinburgh on any subject. So he's a very, very dedicated attender of meetings. Not a fan of me necessarily, but a very dedicated attender of meetings to do with any manner of policies. And I think that the point that's made about Catalonia is an interesting one. There are certainly connections between the 2 movements, if you like. As a government in Scotland, we have been quite careful in saying that it's not for the Scottish government to decide what people in Catalonia should do. That's a matter for them, but they should have a choice and they should have the right to cast a vote peacefully, and that's the chief thing that we've commented on. In terms of the other questions that have been asked, I think I've covered it under what I said about international trade, the questions that were raised about international trade that were raised by Martin Bell.
Okay, thank you. And Emily, particularly this issue of kind of values versus interests and trade in particular.
You see, I think that our foreign policy should begin with the essence of who we are. And I think that as a nation, I think that we are multilateralist. I think that we do believe in international institutions. I think we fall off the wagon sometimes, but I think that most international law, frankly, was written by the British, as was human rights law, and I think that we can be a power for good across the world. And I think that at a time like this, when the whole world order is being threatened by a number of forces, not least Donald Trump, but a number of forces, that I think that there is space for us to step up and be a force for good. Now, I think that being a force for good means that we do not need to be arrogant, but we can be more confident. And I think that there is a real difference. And I think that if we were to take less arrogance and more confidence with us into negotiations in relation to Brexit, I think that we would be in a much better place than we are at the moment. I think that we should also say it as it is. I was ashamed to hear Liam Fox talk about the president of the Philippines, who prides himself on throwing people out of helicopters when he was in the police, and where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people being killed in the Philippines in extrajudicial killings. Liam Fox said that he was a man with whom we shared values. I don't share values with him. And I think that we cannot kowtow in the vain pursuit of trade. I think that of course it's our number one priority has to be in our negotiations. I fully understand any government worth its salt throughout the centuries, no matter what colour, needs to put the exploitation that has happened, appalling exploitation that has happened in the UK, and we've sent it elsewhere where we can turn a blind eye. And in Rana Plaza, where there were clothes being made for Matalan and for Primark and for Benetton, and some of us today may be wearing them, they were being made by people who in Bangladesh where 1,000 people were killed when the ceilings fell down. Where there was, I'm reading the testimony of a woman called Mahmouda who had to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week for £60 a month, making 120 pairs of trousers an hour. And many of her colleagues were killed. So I think that we need to be a bit more honest about what kind of relationships we have sometimes, and if we were to be a country, as I say, that was able to look the world in the eye with confidence and without arrogance, and to sell our excellent goods and our excellent services, and be able to say, buy this because this is the best. That's the approach I think that we should have.
So Emily, to take Philippines for instance, do you think that given the government's problems are clearly there, that trade from the UK can be a force to improve kind of governance and values in the Philippines, or should we be discouraging companies from trading with a country like the Philippines?
I think that one of the most important tools at the moment in terms of foreign policy is the use of sanctions. But I do think that they have to be used wisely and with greatest power that we can. So, for example, the moment with Myanmar, where we did have sanctions against Burma, we were hoping that it would push Burma into the right direction. To a certain extent it did, but there was a latent racism in Burma that has been stirred up against the Rohingya people, and we've seen so many people being killed as a result. Now, I don't believe that Burma or Myanmar is going to give any rights to the Rohingya people without external pressure. And they need to have citizenship, and they need to have security, and they need to have an economic future, and they do not need to be in displacement camps in Myanmar. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, Britain holds the pen in the Security Council, so here we are with an excellent opportunity. We are in the Security Council. We're not supposed to be there to be decorative, so we do have a role. So since we hold the pen, why are we not looking again at introducing sanctions, possibly targeted sanctions, against those in the military who are directly responsible for the murder, for the slaughter of Rohingya people. If we were to be actually on the front foot, instead of just wringing our hands, or indeed perhaps to be fairer, putting large amounts of effort into making the anguish of the Rohingya people in Bangladesh better, but we should be looking for a final solution. There needs to be a final solution. Is not a good phrase, but it needs to be a solution, and that solution needs to be found, and it needs to be led by someone. So, if not us, who? We hold the pen in the Security Council. We're the former colonial power in both Burma and in Bangladesh. What are we doing? Can I tell you, I'm sorry to keep banging on about this, but when there was all the pressure in Burma for there to be some form of democracy, when Labour was last in power, I remember that we became completely proactive and preoccupied with it. All our embassies were campaigning on it. We sent out our foreign secretary to countries in the region in order to make sure that we put maximum amount of pressure, and we did make a difference. And now what happens? We're too busy with Brexit. We're too busy with having Boris Johnson as our foreign secretary that we cannot step up and take world leadership when it is absolutely incumbent on us to do so.
Thank you. Sofia, what do you think, particularly this balance between our interests and our values, and a good point, who was it who said about aid and whether, Alasdair, you mentioned it, didn't you, whether aid should serve a national interest purpose or should be completely divorced of UK interests?
I think it's hard to sell that, to try and completely divorce it. I don't think that it has to be completely separate. I think aid is particularly problematic, and I think in the capitalist structure that exists now, it's easy. The aid as it exists now, I don't think is operating very effectively. In my personal opinion. I think we live in a culture where we think we need to focus on what's going on with us, and we don't. And as Emily just said, Brexit's occupying all of our energy and all of our mental space, and so we're not thinking about what's going on elsewhere. But I think I do agree with what Alasdair said about it being. We need to not do it in our interests. It needs to be for. Aid is not for us. It would be for the recipient. So I think it should be. I think it can be separated.
Sure. Tim, what do you think of that?
Well, I think I would like to go back to answer the two questions that were thrown out to us. 1786, David, the aftermath of the American War of Independence, we were completely broke. Pitt was to come to power and try and deal with our broken economy at that stage. So access to finance, proper skills, having just lost all that opportunity from America, and trying to find an international position, having lost our biggest generator of wealth, was obviously a big issue at that time. Likewise to us, this country is still recovering from what I saw effectively as the same kind of World War effect, loss of value that we had during the financial crisis, which really devastated so many parts of the country and still creates division and grievance amongst our people. So we're still recovering from that ourselves. Luckily, not the same loss of life. I ask our members all the time what are the three main concerns, and I can tell you the three concerns are internationalisation, the lack of appropriate skills, no longer access to finance to SMEs, that's been cured for the time being, but it's the wider economic issues. So nothing is new in the world. And I was speaking to Sofia beforehand about how the wheel turns and so many things keep happening again and again and again. So how do we deal with that? Because you asked, what was the one thing we want to do? The one thing I would really love in the next 12 months was some absolute certainty about workers' rights in this country, as far as access to European workers being assured of their places in this nation, to be welcome here, and also for our student population to be guaranteed that they can flow freely between our great institutions of the world and stay and adorn this country with the skills that we have taught them. I mean, this country in Scotland, I don't care about the UK, Scotland is short of appropriate skills, and I would welcome them all staying. So that certainty would suit us, and that we must get a separate deal somehow from the rest of the UK. I'll give that challenge to the Minister to deal with. And turning to my colleagues from the Scottish Whisky Association, of that 76 million of exports I told you about, 76 billion of exports, 4 billion is whisky. That's a colossal figure. That's something about 6% of our national exports come from the Whisky Association. So we must look after that sector because it's a vital rural, mainly rural-based industry, which, frankly, if we lost whisky or damaged that sector and didn't grow it, we could end up with real deprivation in some of our rural hinterlands. So your point about bringing trade front and centre, if I may rant for a bit longer, on our policy is absolutely right. I made a bold assertion with Sofia earlier that the whole purpose of ambassadors from the Foreign Commonwealth Office, ambassadors, the first thing that any emerging trading nation in history produced was an ambassador to go to the next city to try and seek preferential trade arrangements. We started our very sad tale of imperialism in India by just simply sending some people from London in 1600 in the East India Company to get trade on spice to prove the appalling food back in London. 3 years later, they came back and they made a 3,000% profit. And unfortunately, at that point, everybody then went to India. And from then, many, many tragedies took place, and we're still dealing with that fallout even now. But the important thing is, in a responsible liberal democracy in the West, we have a power, I would use Emily here, we have a power to help people change. The Scottish Government is working with the Scottish Chambers of Commerce by helping us do business to business and business to government contacts in China. So we go to China and we do stuff at very low level, local provincial level, local provincial director levels. The Director of Food Safety and Food Administration in the Shandong province likes us because we go and see him all the time and he's prepared to welcome Scottish goods into his country. Now that's very hard to achieve at governmental level, but business to business you can do that kind of thing. And the other thing you learn in that process is there's nothing to be afraid of from our friends in China. They're just people like us. And the more we all travel and see each other, the less we hate. But Emily's quite right. The reason that they love Scotch whisky in China and Scottish organic gin and Scottish organic Walker's shortbread, they sell it by the ton. The reason they like it is they can be sure that the quality is of the highest European regulation standard. And they like the second label on top of it to demonstrate that it's imported. And they, in turn, as President Xi has acknowledged this, they are themselves trying to address food insecurity which they have in their own country. So they're dealing with their own problems there because we are demonstrating the value of our products. So this is definitely a two-way street, and we must approach trade and international relations as a two-way street with our colleagues. Sorry.
Thanks, Tim. Alasdair, you'll just come back.
Well, I just want to come back to the very useful point you made. You issued a kind of challenge there, quite rightly, about what can be done around the issue of European citizens who work here and whom, it should be said, as you've just said, we urgently need to stay here, not just for economic reasons, but for human reasons too. A big part of my job in the last couple of years has been going around different communities who live in Scotland from different European nationalities and hearing about some of the very real human practical problems that are faced as a result of having gone all these many months without real clear answers as to what they're supposed to do. Now those can be practical problems in the sense that it becomes difficult to get a mortgage if you can't prove where you will be in a few months' time, to real questions about, as you mentioned, around skill shortages and where they fit into our economy. But I just wanted to emphasise something that I said earlier on. We're talking a bit about history, all of us I think, is that Scotland's history of the movement of people is very different from that of the rest of the UK. We've been a huge net exporter of people throughout the whole of the 19th and 20th centuries. We only started to have, and I'm very glad we did, started to have net inward migration about 2001. Now, as a result of that very different demographic, we are going to face a real demographic problem in terms of our workforce shrinking. And we are going to face that problem unless, as you've quite rightly said, Tim, we come up with distinctive solutions. Now, there is a wider political consensus than you would think in Scotland about this thing, about the need for a tailored immigration and tailored migration policy that fits Scotland's needs. I saw Westminster, their committee on integration, were looking at this very thing recently. There are ways in which this can be done. There are ways in which UK visas, without having our own immigration system, there are ways in which UK visas could be tailored to allow for the fact that we have an urgent demographic problem, and we've put forward some pretty detailed proposals as to how that could be done if the UK government are willing to listen.
Thank you, Alasdair. Caroline, I mean, there's lots to pick up on there, but particularly this issue of now DIT is a separate department from the SCO. Has it taken the business out of diplomacy, or is it still a kind of central, even more central part of what you're doing?
I can assure you that our ambassadors overseas are ambassadors for the whole of Her Majesty's government, and that includes trade and every other department. And actually our posts are really excellent collaborative places. I've worked in many. I was the head of UK trade investment, now DIT in Russia, as well as combining Foreign Office elements to my job. And it worked very well, and we collaborate very well. And our ambassadors over the world promote everything from haggis to Harris Tweed and whisky to wealth management in Scotland, and biotech to tartan and so on, and they will continue to do so, as well as seeking those trade privileges that others have mentioned. I mean, on trade and on values, I think that the more we trade, the more engaged, the more interaction we have, and the more exchanges we have with other countries, the more opportunity we have as well to influence and, as Emily said, be a force for good. So actually, they're not mutually exclusive. Yes, there could be some difficult issues down the line, but they're not mutually exclusive. You can't influence if you don't have those links, and trade is the basis for those. If I just say a word on Catalonia, I certainly don't want to get into a debate in Catalonia, but it is a very different situation. You cannot draw parallels, and Spain's got a constitution which is very clear. It's a democratic country. We have to respect that they have a constitution, their own rule of law, and they have a way of dealing with the situation there in line with their rule of law, and that is what they're doing. As for what one might wish for in the next year, I think a deal on a future partnership, security and economic partnership with the European Union that is ambitious, that is deep and special, all of those adjectives that we use describing the partnership that we want, to see that resulting over the course of the next year would be very good.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's have some more questions. Wow. Okay. I was going to suggest some themes, but I don't think I will. I think I'll let it. So this gentleman here in the middle with the blue top. Come this way, and he's looking at you. There you go. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks. My name is Nigel Harper. I'm the chair of a small charity here in Edinburgh that does work in Malawi and also in Zambia. And I just wanted to follow up from what Alasdair was saying about just using Malawi as an example, that internationally the effect of a small amount of money contributed by the Scottish government has led to an incredible economic but also cultural relationship between a very small small country which is Scotland and a very small African country which is Malawi. But the benefits, people always look at it maybe just for what does Malawi get out of it, but also what Scotland gets out of it, which is remarkable. Alasdair probably knows more than me, but I think it's nearly 50% of the people in Scotland know somebody who is either involved with Malawi or works with a charity or has read about, and the knowledge in Scotland about international affairs, particularly a small African, it's remarkable. And one way that hopefully maybe could be encouraged in the future, I've mentioned it to Alasdair, is whether that could become a template for other countries in Europe to use, because it's a small amount of money, but the relationship between Malawi and Scotland is remarkable and could be replicated in Europe. And the other point I wanted to say was about ethics. I think ethics is 100% key, because what Scotland is internationalist, and the key word was what Emily said, solidarity. And it disgusts people here to see what's happening in Yemen and Burma, and enough with this idea of trade first, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Very valuable contribution. You've got the mic, so yeah. And then
Charles Mullen, retired UK civil servant. My question relates to the interaction between the Scottish government and the UK government, and indeed with any other devolved administration. What we've heard today indicates that there are strong and particular needs as respects Scotland, particularly as regards immigration, which also affects foreign policy and Home Office policy. And of course, immigration and foreign policy are both reserved matters. and the UK government has to listen, and I hope it's listening, to what the devolved administrations are saying. We live in a union, and unionism, I suggest, like love, should be a verb and not just a noun. It requires daily action. And I'm just wondering, and it's perhaps an unfair question to ask the FCO director as opposed to a politician, as to what are the daily interactions between the UK government and the Scottish government, and what political commitment is there to take into account particular interests of different parts of the union, albeit that may make policy more complicated.
Okay, that's a good question. Right, now, the lady in the middle, halfway back, you. No, you just passed it. She's in that right. She's looking at you. Yeah.
Thank you. Mary Leslie, former diplomat. The reality of Brexit is, of course, that British foreign policy will take a severe hit and become more challenging, and British trade will take a hit and become more challenging. So it's a question of where we put the investment at a time when, at least for a transition, perhaps longer unless we can actually reverse Brexit, the economy and the tax base will also be smaller. So we're going to have to be much more selective about both. Global Britain actually isn't a reality. It's going to be selective Britain with priorities. And I would be very interested in hearing from the panel where they think those priorities would be in the Scottish interest, and whether there's any difference between the Scottish interest and the broader British interest.
Good, thank you very much. I think, in fact, the lady, gentleman, sorry, just at the front here, let's take.
My name is Abir Rakeja. I'm a fourth-year politics student from India. I liked Emily's point about the fact that the UK government should not be giving bandwidth to countries like Myanmar and the Philippines with Rodrigo Duterte. I appreciate that point. But if I can flip this on the head and say that the way international justice has worked over the last century, even after the Second World War, has been very much in favour of victor's justice. I mean, the Allies did hold Germany and Japan, and rightly so, to justice, but there were war crimes, including the fire bombings in Dresden, which were never punished. And even today, the US, which has committed atrocities in Abu Ghraib, and still runs a detention camp in Guantanamo, where Amnesty International has said, crimes against humanity have been committed. So don't you think that this notion of having a high moral ground in international relations is used by consecutive governments to meet their ends as long as it suits their needs?
Thank you. Good point. Okay, let's come back to the panel now. I think we'll have some questions after this. We're still okay for time. There's a good cluster here about kind of innovation and whether we're using the talents and skills that we've got at the moment, and the level of communication that's currently, Alistair, you might want to, I mean, it's kind of a technical, Caroline, you might have a view on that. And then the priorities, very good question. Post-Brexit, where are we going to focus our efforts? How are we going to, and how can we ensure that we do so, not based on just what a small self-selecting group may decide, but on a genuinely kind of what the whole UK interests are. And then, the question of kind of hypocrisy versus consistency, there's a lot to unwrap there. Tim?
Oh, God. Really? You want me to start with me?
Yeah, I think in terms of priorities, I'm particularly interested in where should we focus our efforts post-Brexit?
Yeah, you've gone to the rank amateur to start with, while everyone else thinks through their answer. Okay, priorities post-Brexit. That's very interesting. I can't say what I had, but I had an interesting conversation with a high-ranking Chinese gentleman about what they thought as a nation about Brexit. They welcomed it. That was a very good idea. Of course, when you're dealing with other countries, you have to understand what perspective they're coming at it from. And that probably means what benefits them more than it benefits us. Because, let's be understand, this is the world is not full of benign organisations all looking to support us and look after the British people and bring them in part of it. This is some people, some nations view it as a zero-sum game. So you asked what the priorities would be. I would say that we have to understand there'll be lots of people out there looking to offer us trade deals which we will look very tempting to a government in the aftermath of whatever negotiation we get from Brexit. That Brexit negotiation may not be quite as favourable as the terms of which we currently exist inside the European Union. Therefore, we're going to find people like President Trump offering us doing lots more business, I think is the expression he used. And the Chinese very keen to engage with us as well. We have to be very careful about accepting whatever terms are offered by those nations. It'll be up to better minds than mine, the Foreign Office and the government, to decide what are the better terms. But business needs to trade. We need to have access to the world markets. We don't trade in Scotland effectively. In fact, the UK doesn't trade effectively enough with the rest of the world, and we need to do that. So I would hope that one of the colleagues there, Nigel, he said that it shouldn't always be trade first. No, I absolutely understand that. There must be an ethical rule of law as to what British businesses can and can't do abroad. They mustn't break the law, and I think voters and consumers will also ensure that their ethics are maintained. But we have to put trade front and centre of what we do in our foreign policy, because if we don't, we're not going to get the wealth that we need in our nation to carry on being a liberal democracy, an open, welcoming liberal democracy we want it to be. So I understand in an audience like this, which are many young people, there'll be some frustrations about the hypocrisy of the world, and they'll equivocate between the behaviour of perhaps the Bush administration and Vladimir Putin, which I find very difficult actually to do. I think sometimes when people start getting quite excited about our behaviour in Britain and compare it, say, to the Burma regime in Myanmar, we're not the same at all, and therefore I agree with Emily. We should not descend to that level neither. But we have to be realistic. Trade has to exist. If we don't sell lots and lots of whiskey abroad, we're not going to be able to maintain parts of our own nation. If we don't trade our goods and services and share knowledge to our universities, we're not going to have that influence and power for good that I hope we would have.
Thank you, Tim. Emily.
Okay, so I think we need to. I mean, I've been trying to talk about other issues apart from Brexit, just to give myself, an hour's Brexit rest. But let's go on to Brexit. Let's talk about Brexit. Yeah. So you guys voted to remain in the European Union. Guess what? So did my constituents. So did London. So did Northern Ireland. So no. But those people who I represent directly, 75% of them voted to remain in the European Union, and I am a constituency MP. This is hard stuff. This is hard stuff. But the point is this: that a divided country voted 52%, 48%. We have to be Democrats at the end of the day. As politicians, we are public servants. And what we have to do is we have to find a solution that works for all the regions and the nations of the United Kingdom and find the best one. And what, in my view, we need to do, and I've said it throughout, and I'm really pleased to hear Philip Hammond sounding a little bit laboury these days, right, is that of course we have to leave the European Union, but this is not rocket science. If you want to try and keep the 48% and the 52% as close together as possible, you've got the Tories plumping for the 52%, you've got the Scots Nats and the Liberals plumping for the 48%, but what we're trying to do in the Labour Party is hold the country together, hold the nation together, and do this. Yes, we leave, and we don't go very far. We don't go very far. And there are so many reasons for doing that. You keep the 48% happy, the 52% get what they want, but in the end, that's what works for our economy. That's what works for our economy. That's what works for my kids' jobs. That's what works for the future of our country. So of course we need to be close to our closest trading partner. The idea of having some form of segmented immigration policy, I think, is an interesting intellectual idea. But for those of us who have constituents who have been plugging away with the Home Office, trying to get their immigration status sorted out, even as things stand, before we start making it even more complicated for them, I think it's just not going to work. I mean, there have been some interesting debates about national insurance numbers and about perhaps national insurance numbers being given out, but in Scotland or in particular regions, I have a national insurance number from London, I can work in London, but then how do you police it? I think what we need to do is we need to have a policy that works for the regions, works for our communities, and we have to begin it without going into negotiations with a whole lot of stupid red lines. Oh, we're not going to have anything to do with the European Court of Justice because somehow or other I've got it confused with the European Court of Human Rights. I don't like this and I don't like that, and we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that, and is the Tory party happy with that? We shouldn't be thinking about the Tory party and the internal politics of the Tory party. We should be thinking about the United Kingdom when we go into those negotiations. And we currently have a government that's not prepared to do that. That's why we're in the mess that we're in. That's why we're there. You know, we need to be pragmatists first and foremost, it seems to me. Anyway, enough on that. I had a very... I was brought up on a big council estate, and my mum was a single parent, but my dad was in the UN. And I'd only ever been on a day trip to France, and my dad arrived and said, I'm going to take you to Africa. And I went to Zambia, and I spent my 15th birthday under a tree in Malawi. And so Malawi has a really particularly special place in my heart. And I think that when you have a kind of a twinning, or a relationship, of course both sides get a huge amount out of it. And for people to really identify with the humanity of someone who, yeah, you know, superficially there may be some differences, but in the end there's so much. I mean, it's like what we have in common is so much. And so much we can learn from one another. And the differences are actually ones where we can learn from other people. We can learn about values that they have, and perhaps there may be values that we have forgotten or we don't kind of quite realise just the importance of them. You put them in a slightly different context and you realise how much we can learn. So it's this mutual learning, which when you have a close relationship of those sorts, it's so beneficial. And I've met, when I was in Parliament last week, in fact, I met some Malawian politicians who were being shown around by some of my Scottish friends. And it was really interesting to talk to them about, you know, how close. So, I mean, I hear what you say, and I've heard it from people from Malawi as well. And I applaud the projects and the work of Scottish people. You did mention Yemen enough for me to say something. The other pen, on the Security Council, we have two jobs. One is that we're a pen holder when it comes to the Rohingya, and guess what the other one is? The other major mess in the world, Yemen. We are the pen holder when it comes to Yemen. We are supposed to be finding a peace process in Yemen. A year and a quarter ago, there was a peace resolution that the British had drafted. It was supposed to be going to the European Council, the Security Council, and it got pulled. And I asked at the time, I got a copy of it, and I said, what's wrong with this? Why aren't you putting this before the Security Council? And I was told that it needs to be updated. Oh, it says peace, but there isn't peace. Yeah, that's the whole point about a peace process. And, oh no, we're going to update it. Don't worry, Emily, we're coming back. Well, we continue to wait. And now every single child in Yemen is dependent on aid. And they have cholera, and they have diphtheria. I didn't even know what diphtheria was. I thought it was just something that I had my children inoculated against. You know what diphtheria does to babies? It strangles them alive. You know, they have diphtheria in Yemen now. They have so many people who are being killed. There are fields being bombed. There are weddings being bombed. There are funerals being bombed, and they're being bombed by the Saudis, who are supposed to be our friends. They're supposed to be our allies, and we provide the bombs. So we not only arm the Saudis, and it's not just the Saudis. And I appreciate there are two sides who are committing atrocities, but you know, but we continue to provide arms to a country that is doing this. And until there is a proper international investigation into what has been going on, it seems to me perfectly clear we should not be selling arms to Saudi Arabia in these circumstances. And that's what we should be doing. And if we had a government worth its salt, that's what we were doing. If we were properly proud of who we were, as opposed to simply arrogant, that's what we would be doing instead. You know, that's actually what an ethical foreign policy looks like, in my view. And we would also be doing something in terms of making sure that we could bring the parties together and we could actually start working towards peace, as opposed to allowing everyone else to knock us around when we are supposed to be taking a leadership role in Yemen.
So Alasdair, there's almost too much I want you to cover, but I'm particularly interested in what you think the priorities post-Brexit should be, but there's also this issue of communication, current status of communication, and for priorities. So, I mean, one of my personal frustrations is that post-Brexit, often the debate, understandably, is dominated by what should be our post-Brexit relationship with Europe. But of course, there's a whole lot of the world out there as well, and we can't stand still. We have to be thinking about our relationship, particularly trade with other parts of the world. So I'd be particularly interested in, I know you want to talk about Europe as well, but where should our focus be?
Well, maybe if I can, when you're talking about the rest of the world first, if I can pick up on the point that was made about Malawi and does it have a wider relevance, I think it probably does. I don't pretend that we've got our policy on Malawi unique or perfect, but there is a unique friendship there, largely thanks to the history and largely thanks to one man, David Livingstone, who is universally credited with everyone you will meet in Malawi, quite rightly, with having a central role in abolishing slavery in that part of Africa. So there are connections like that lots of countries can probably develop and make use of to the full. But in terms of Europe, I'm sorry I have to come back to Europe, but I think the question was essentially asking, what is the day job, the daily action, as I think it was put between the UK and Scottish governments. And I think it's fair to say that despite the real differences that exist and the frustration that you can tell coming out in what I say, there is daily contact at an official level, at a political level between the two governments, and there are lots of things, for instance, around the threats, the common threats that face us, which I know you'll be talking about later on, that we work on very closely. I think there are possibly two areas that highlight the need for a closer working relationship. The first has been, say, the joint ministerial committees, which are useful and are a good thing, which operate between the devolved administrations and the UK government, which are convened and chaired by the UK government. The main one of those, dealing with Brexit, did not meet recently for 8 months. So there have been frustrations around that. I think things have been getting better. There is more of a conversation there than there was. But there have been very, very long radio silences in terms of actual face-to-face opportunities given by the UK government for that kind of formal engagement between all the devolved administrations. And the other one is the withdrawal bill. There have been common ground, I think, across the political spectrum in Scotland. My party was able to support Labour amendments recently in the House of Commons. There was a vote in the Scottish Parliament in which all parties, including the Conservatives, were quite rightly anxious about the fact that we currently have a withdrawal bill going through the Westminster Parliament, which does strip powers away from the Scottish Parliament. And that is a concern, as I say, that was universally expressed just this week across the parties in the Scottish Parliament. That is now, of course, in the House of Lords and slightly beyond, therefore, any kind of normal democratic scrutiny. But there is an opportunity there to put that right, and the two governments will work together closely to try to achieve that. But there are real frustrations along the way when promises are made about cooperation that don't follow through. But we need to try, if we can, to get beyond those all the time. And most crucially, most urgently of all, there is a need to find a common way forward around the single market. I am not entirely clear, if I can be diplomatic about this, what all parties' views are about whether we should remain in the single market. Perhaps we're here today.
Thank you very much. Caroline, you might want to pick up on other stuff, but I'm really interested as well in your kind of more the technical side of the engagement between Whitehall and Edinburgh, particularly on foreign issues, and how they are engaging at the moment.
Yes, well, there is extensive and indeed, as we've heard, daily contact between government departments in London, between DEXU and Edinburgh and others in Scotland, and also there is a ministerial process as well, and there has been lots of contact, and obviously so many issues do concern devolved matters, so the information, a lot of it is held here. We have to work very closely, and we're doing so. As for the Foreign Office, I mean, we are trying to ensure that we truly represent all of the United Kingdom, including all the devolved administrations, so we're doing more and more with them. Our heads of mission, our ambassadors, before they go out to post, come as part of their preparation, come to Edinburgh and go to other capitals as well. And many of them visit here, and there is a very significant part of their work, depending on where they are, is devoted to representing the interests of Scotland, however you define those. So,
and there was the gentleman who mentioned, and it's a particular theme of the British foreign policy, whether particularly government and specifically FCO always draws on the depth and the breadth of expertise that there is across the UK as kind of systematically as it might do.
Well, no, frankly, we don't always draw on it as much as we might do, because honestly, it takes time. And as you can imagine, other people have talked about some of the many priorities at the moment. We should be doing it. We do try to do it, but we're not perfect, and we do what we can, and we want to do more of it. And with your help and others' help, hopefully we will. But of course, we can do it much better.
Sofia, is there anything you want to come in on in particular?
I mean, I guess to Abby's point there, that's something I definitely agree with about. I think there is quite, to a certain extent, hypocrisy in this system, and I think that acknowledging that, like Violet was saying about being responsible and aware, and yeah, we're not the same, so we need to be aware of that in our trading relations, but also, yeah, coming out and saying that. I think that that's something that, again, speaking for young people, I think that would be, it's encouraging to see that. It's not like acknowledging where things are, like coming out and saying that they're wrong. But.
Okay, right, we're heading towards the final straight, so we're going to have another round of questions. I think we'll see how we go, but it might be the last. This gentleman at the front here, please, Roddy. And can I just make we're having terrible gender balance here in terms of questioning. So so this lady, thank you very much. So Roddy first.
Sorry, I can't do anything about that. I have got 4 sisters, that's any help to you. I'm Roddy Gow, I'm the founder and chairman of the Asia Scotland Institute. And Tom, what a terrific achievement to have brought everybody together today. Congratulations to the BFPG. There's one theme which all the panellists seem to violently agree with, and that is the issue of engaging with tomorrow's leaders, the future. Our mission is to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders in Scotland. But I asked the panel what they can do to address this absurd issue about deterring foreign students from coming here. Not only is there the Brexit issue, which is a major problem for universities such as this one, but it is driving students from Asia, particularly, to Australia and elsewhere, where these sorts of barriers don't exist. I cannot believe that on a multi-party basis, this is not something to be dealt with, and I would like to hear from the panellists what can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. So thank you very much to this lady here, and then there's the lady behind you as well. And then the lady at the back.
Hi, thank you. Thanks to gender parity. It's always a good thing. My name is Josephine. I'm a student at University of Edinburgh, and thanks for holding this panel today. It's been quite a range of topics we've been covering today. But I know we're talking about foreign policy, but I have a question regarding Scotland and the UK's environmental policies, and considering the variety of experiences we have today, I would like to ask a question more to the entire panel in terms of what should Scotland's post-Brexit strategy be to engage with its CO2 emission targets, to engage with its commitments to renewable energies, to entrepreneurship through renewable energies, to strategic engagement with the European Union and its financial subsidies across and abroad, both in Europe and beyond. What should the UK strategy be? And considering your experiences, what should the UK's move be within the next year from each one of your point of view? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. And there's the lady behind you.
Hi there, my name is Hina. I work for First Aid Africa, a small international charity that works with partners in East and Southern Africa. My question is in relation to all topics covered today. How can we implement the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and to ensure that we commit to consider our responsibility to international development, consider that with everything within foreign policy as well as within trade?
Thank you. So there's a lady, there we go. Lady right at the back.
Kate Evans from Amnesty International. I was just wondering what the panel thinks is the scope for Scotland to have a feminist foreign policy, and what the panel might like that to look like.
Thank you. Yeah, and there's been an incredible, really interesting movement emerging on a feminist foreign policy. Lots there. Any other question? We'll take a couple more. We'll take the gentleman at the back there. We might have time for one more.
Mike McKirdy, Director of Global Health at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow. To pick up on the point that the previous speaker made about the Sustainable Development Goals, we've talked a lot today about trade and security. If those are our ambitions in foreign policy, then that will lead to the obscenity of trading at all costs and selling arms to Saudi Arabia to drop on the poor people of Yemen. If security is only about our security and not about security elsewhere in the world, then we will make the world a much more insecure place for ourselves. So that's my comment. My question, to echo the one earlier, should we not start with the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Should that not be where our foreign policy is grounded, creating a fairer world in which we can create fairer trade, in which security is not just about arms, but is about food security and environmental security?
Okay, thank you. And then last question, I'm afraid. There's a lady kind of towards the right on the edge, just there.
Hi, my name's Hannah Campbell. I'm a History of Art postgraduate student, and I'm probably one of the only History of Art people in the room. There's a question on the questions. It's how can we make other people who don't have policies a day-to-day issue? How can that, come into them in their day-to-day lives? The University of Edinburgh is great on its arts and humanities. And how can we implement the essence of Scotland, which is so much of its arts and culture, into foreign policy and make that more international in a way that's not just whiskey and tartan and shortbread? How can we actually utilise some of Scotland's greatest assets, which are its music, its art and its cultural scenes and its heritage? How can we actually make that international in a positive and a non-kitschy way, I guess?
Good question. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to close it to questions there. It's a good time to say, we want to carry on this discussion. We want to encourage further discussions to take place here, elsewhere in the UK, elsewhere in Scotland as well. So we hope that you will allow us to stay in touch with you. We've got your emails, we know where you are. If you don't want us to use it, let us know, but we will stay in touch. We've got our brilliant student ambassadors here, which we're growing that network, not just in Edinburgh, but in universities around Scotland and the UK. And we hope that and a number of other interventions will be the basis of a more sustained series of conversations around some of these issues. That being the case, why don't we go along the panel from Sofia? There's a lot of issues there, the environmental sustainable development goals, feminist foreign policy issues, and also, how do we innovate? How do we ensure that Scottish soft power is not about just those traditional things, but also about modern Scotland?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think all of those questions are compatible with the question about having foreign policy be feminist. I think, as was pointed out, I don't remember that was so many points, but all we've spoken about so far is like trade, homeland security, and if they're our only priorities, then I don't think anything will change. And I think acknowledging, had the question been asked about what are the biggest threats, I think we've ignored the fact that none of this matters if the climate change and the environmental degradation keeps going the way it is. So I think not necessarily changing our priorities, because I think that would be quite unrealistic, but I think acknowledging other things are as important. Like the Sustainable Development Goals, any kind of environmental policy is really important. That's something that I think we should be really proud of here in Scotland, is a kind of commitment, hopefully more and more so, commitment to renewable energy. I think, and there was a question about students as well.
That's right, these questions. Sorry. Student immigration.
And I think that's something, again, I don't know exactly why students would kind of defer to, Australasia or elsewhere, but I think if we need to keep this open, kind of welcoming culture, where I think in Scotland we like to think of ourselves as being, the most open to immigration part of the UK. And I think if we have a reputation, or if there's the culture where people don't feel like they're not going to be welcome, then that would put students off, because you don't want to go somewhere where you feel like you're going to be marginalised. I think that's something Edinburgh's good for. I think that we have, definitely one of the most highest number of international students in the UK. But I think keeping an emphasis on them being welcome, and we need them as well, because we're free tuition for Scots.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I'll try and pick up on a couple of those things. Certainly the point about overseas students is something that, again, there's been a lot of work done on in Scotland, again, cross-party consensus, working to try and get, as we have done to a limited extent, change out of the UK government on this one. Of course, a lot of this goes back to the decision to have students counted in this stupid 100,000 target for net migration, which is at the root of so many of the problems we now find ourselves tied up in on migration policy. We're now in a situation where there are a list of universities in Edinburgh is on them, which will be able essentially to have something like a post-study work visa. We think that should be available to all students who are studying here in Scotland. These are people who are contributing socially, culturally, paying their taxes, filling the skills gaps that we were hearing about, and developing our economy for the future. So I don't see any excuse for there not being a much more widely available post-study work visa. And some of the more general points, I think perhaps the one that was most important, I think, was around the sustainable, or not the most important, but perhaps the one that's most relevant to what I've got to say about the UN sustainable goals. To the limited extent that Scotland does have a foreign policy, that is at the centre of it. But I think perhaps one of the keys to making that work is to have a public discourse which links the UN global goals, not just to our foreign policy, but also to ensuring justice, social justice here at home, tying the two together. And frankly, if I may say this in public, a lot of this also comes down to tackling head-on the very organised campaign in some sections of the media, we won't mention which. Some sections of the media are ideologically opposed to all money being spent on any project in the developing world, and we have to just call that out for what it is, ignore the calls for politicians to conform to that particular agenda and tackle it head on.
Thank you. Emily?
I think you're right. I think that it's a fault line. I think that there are different ways of looking at things. I think that we can try and pull up the drawbridge and look after ourselves and say things are hard. We're having to leave the European Union. Whatever else. You know, our National Health Service is in a terrible state. We have to look after ourselves now. Now is the crisis, and you know, charity begins at home. And another way of looking at it is that it's a small planet that is getting smaller, that we are completely interconnected, and that we have a responsibility to be citizens of the world. And that is certainly our approach. I know it's your approach. It's, you know, and I think that it's an approach of most people here. But we have to keep making those arguments. And we have to keep making the arguments that 0.7% is not about us, it's about doing the right thing. It's just doing it because it's right. Because we're a rich country, we don't feel very rich. Go to Malawi, see if you really see them, then come back and tell us if you're rich or not. You know, sort of learn. We have a responsibility. Of course we have a responsibility. And you're right. I mean, Des Brown, who'll be speaking later on, I'm sure, will talk about, you know, security in terms of a broader issue than simply, you know, guns. I mean, it's our security is about having a world order which is sustainable, and meeting the challenges of climate change, of extreme poverty. You know, if you were born in a country where your children had, if you were bringing up children in a country where your children had absolutely, you know, no opportunity and would be able to sustain themselves, let alone have a family, what would you do? What would you do? And who can criticise? And so what do we do in response? What's our responsibility? We can't all turn up in Edinburgh. There isn't enough space here. So, but you know, we need to have a world which is sustainable. And of course it has to be an absolutely integral part, it has to be an absolute central part of our foreign policy, to do everything that we can, to use every influence that we have, to try to make sure that our world is one whereby people do have a chance. Because in the end, you go to Malawi, the thing that you will learn, I imagine, is that actually all of us want is a better chance for our kids than we had for ourselves. And to have some form of opportunity, to have some form of security, to believe that we are safe. And that binds all of us. And quite frankly, a very large part of the world doesn't have that opportunity. And we do. And we have a responsibility to that. And you can call that feminist foreign policy. I suspect it probably is, but I think there's an awful lot of guys here who agree with that too. And that, I think, should be the heart of our attitude when it comes to foreign policy.
Thank you, Emily. And Tim, I'm sure you'll have.
Yeah, let's keep on that.
But there's also this, you know, how do we stop soft power, especially for Scotland turning into a kind of oldie Scotland, you know, how do we turn into something modern and forward-looking?
That's my last point. Can I deal with quick-fire responses? Ronnie Gow. The way to deal with student visas is to change Theresa May's mind, because she has no cabinet support and she's an outlier, and until the Prime Minister changes her mind about this, we're not going to get any traction, so she needs to change her mind. Feminist foreign policy. I've got two daughters, both one who's at university in Bristol, one who's about to go to university in Exeter. And these girls are...
Women?
Yes. Okay. That's... I won't talk about how that sort of kind of defeats the conversation. Okay, these daughters of mine are splendid young people. They're fantastic, and the young men that they are friends with, their group, sort of 21st, they're fantastic people. And what we need is more.
No, I'm listening.
We're just heckling you with our body language.
Well, yeah. What I'm saying is, we need many more young women with opportunities to go out into the world and do this stuff on equal footings. I would not want anyone to treat my children any way different from any other children. So it's that equality of opportunity and access is what we want for young women. We don't need necessarily some ghastly feminist tract from the 1980s about women and women's roles, but we do need to address the inequality. And if that means quotas, and if that means some kind of element of rebalancing the scales, we should do it. But what we need is plenty more young women given the opportunity to go out into the world and make their mark. As far as a very good question about environmental policy, how do we, Josephine, you asked that question, but how do we enshrine it in UN policy? How do we adopt that? Law. If we feel as a nation that we need to, we want to be strict about our relationship with hydrocarbons or with pollution or the environment, we need to enshrine it in law. That will make people do things. Plastic bags, where 5 pence was put on it at the till, that cut the plastic bag industry overnight. So people need to be made to do things sometimes. But that has another corollary, because if you suddenly get rid of the hydrocarbons, then you need to generate your electricity from somewhere else, otherwise your iPhones won't work. Okay, so we need nuclear. Now, I don't think the Scottish Government necessarily agree with that. And we need a lot more offshore wind. But we need, in order to get the cars off the roads that the government is proposing by 2040, we will need 7 Hinkley points to generate that electricity. I know that because that's the business I'm in, is in fuel stations. We don't have the infrastructure or the electricity generation to do what you wish to do, although let's do it. Let's be honest about it, let's do it, if that's what we want to do. Likewise, colleagues talking about the abhorrence of selling weapons to the Saudis to drop on Yemen. Absolutely. I can understand everybody's revulsion of that kind of behaviour, so we won't sell weapons as a nation. That will have implications as far as the trade union is concerned, the impact on British defence industries. So be it. We have to be honest as a population that we wish to do that. So my kind of appeal is a sense of honesty as an electorate. If you want to do all these things, if you want to take those risks, it's going to cost us more. Okay, we're going to have to make sacrifices. That might mean more taxation individually. Fine, let's have more taxation, but we have to be honest in that dialogue that we have. And the final point now I'm trying to get to is the one about the cultural, not kitsch. One of my great pleasures is I'm vice chairman of the V&A project in Dundee. And Dundee is a city which has suffered very greatly with post-industrial malaise. It was regarded as a real forgotten city during the 1980s. And look at it now. It has absolutely revolutionised the place. The confidence, the spring in the step for people of Dundee has been achieved by cultural investment and the recognition that Scottish contribution to the world is not just tartan or Harrisfeed or Walker's shortbread. It is actually something much greater than that. It's a digital arts, a digital design, and the opportunities those two wonderful universities in Dundee provide. So Dundee has been told by Visit Scotland to become a cultural centre as opposed to any kind of industrial centre. Not digital, cultural. Now I would disagree with that to a certain extent because I think there's a huge job to be done in digital and the world-beating life sciences at Dundee University. But Scotland has a lot more to offer than just simply tartan and tat. Scotland's cultural heritage is a rich one, and things like the V&A are demonstrating how much stronger it's going to be.
Great, thank you. Caroline, last words.
Yes, so
I mean, those of you who have rightly talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, all the other issues, please don't think that the absence of those from the conversation earlier meant that those aren't important. I think what we were doing, some of us, was looking really at the consequences of Brexit and what that meant, and I think perhaps there were areas where we see there are more issues from Brexit, but in terms of the development goals and so on, we are as attached to those as ever, and they're as vital as ever. And there's a question mark in the future about how we work with other big donors, including the EU, and it'll be very interesting to see how that is resolved. As for feminist foreign policy, Emily's friend, the Foreign Secretary, is very attached to the education of women and girls throughout the world, because he does believe that many of the issues globally could be resolved with better education for women and girls. So that is something which, with DFID's Plan for International Development, we're working on. And yeah, leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. This is good. We only kind of 10 minutes late, so apologies for overrunning. I want to thank all of our speakers. Thank you so much. If we can all give them a round of applause. So we're going to have a brief break for tea and coffee. If we can try and come back here at 1500, where we're going to kind of drill down in some of these issues in